On Film by Charlie Davenport, narrated by Otis Jiry. I don't know how long the film had sat in that box at my family's place. The four rolls had been swept up with a number of small items in my mom's effects. Things that I can't explain why we took them. Keys, loose change, Polaroids that had begun to blur with the deterioration of age. Things too small, too transient to have any value, sentimental or otherwise. They were all things that could easily be brushed into a trash bag. All of the big-ticket items, as Jake had called them, had been tucked away into all the cut-rate storage facilities we could find around Rhode Island, and it was just down to a few scraps that needed to be cleared away before the realtors brought in the first of the prospective buyers. I had fully intended to leave them in the hotel to let some poor maid working for minimum wage and whatever tips tourists decided to give her deal with the last of my burdens. However, Ella had carefully placed the bag into her checked luggage, reasoning that I'd cared enough to take them, so I must have wanted them. It wasn't until we were back in California that I found the glossy black bag crinkling under my wife's unmentionables. The collection of jangled keys, quarters, and lost memories took up residence in a drawer right below our linen closet for several more months. Why she chose to get them developed, where she even found a place that still did that kind of thing, I'll never know. I am, by trade and nature, a logical man, concerned with all the measurable things in life. This characteristic was a constant source of frustration to my mother, who placed great value on the unknown and unseen of the world. I'm sure she would have told me that Ella, my wife, had taken the bag and had them developed because I was supposed to see them, that it was part of some larger plan. I came home after battling Friday traffic and saw a manila envelope sitting on our dining room table with my name and a note scrawled across it in a black marker. According to my wife's message, each roll had held only one photograph each. This little odd fact was enough for me to sit down and take a look. We had some of Mom's pictures hanging at the house, the same kind she'd sold at her roadside shop. Ansel Adams-style landscapes and snapshots of small-town New England that Norman Rockwell would have loved. Panoramics of the ocean in full roar, tossing fishing vessels onto random peaks and valleys. The town commons on the 4th of July filled with bustling crowds of people carrying plates of barbecue, and children filling the foreground as they raced past with their sparklers blazing. Tourists to our sleepy little town purchased them in numbers high enough to cover the heating bills in the winter months and the darkroom chemicals she needed year-round. She loved the town and the people that resided there in a way that shone through in her work. Mom always proclaimed that if you hadn't been born with the good fortune to be from Hampton, Rhode Island, you could at least take a piece home with you. Looking at them filled me with a profound sense of regret. I got a beer from the fridge before I sat down to look at the contents of the folder. The images in the folder were far different from what I was used to from my mom's lens. The first showed a heavy early morning mist wrapping itself around tall tombstones, monuments to settlers originally from the Plymouth and Massachusetts colonies and the generations of their descendants that had lived and died there, all of them now feeding the soil. I recognized it as the Bicknell Cemetery right across from the house I'd grown up in. I had passed by it every morning and evening, looked in at it in sunshine and in shadow every day, more or less for 18 years, but never like this. The color had been bled out of the shot. At first, I thought it was in black and white. The lawn was the only splash of, life in the picture. With all that mist in the air, the grass should have been verdant, but it was pale, bleached, brutalized imitation of green. Even still, as I held the picture by the edges, I swore I could almost feel the dampness. My mother had never understood my motivations for moving. She couldn't bear the thought of me living out there, not just out of Rhode Island, but in California, of all places. I could still remember the phone call where she'd outlined all of the deaths in LA County via natural disaster or crime every year. Earthquakes, brush fires, mudslides, and that eternal dryness were as close to her idea of a living hell as she could imagine. I took a slug of beer, which quickly became a gulp. It was bitter and cleansing. I rubbed my fingers together absently, and I found they were wet. In my opposite hand, I held a bottle beaded with sweat. Another gulp, and before I knew it, the beer was more than half gone. I set the photo aside, feeling exhausted by the effort of simply looking at it. The next photo was of a single mailbox I didn't recognize at first. There was a long row of trees behind it, allowing no view of what lay on the other side. Across from it was another long stand of trees, both sides forming a border to a road that stretched out toward some point in the distance. The quality of the light suggested that it could have been taken around midnight, but as this photo was actually black and white, it was difficult to tell. It was as empty and still as the first photo had been, but I had the sense of an intense sort of life to it, like there was something rustling just around the edges of what it had to show. I could hear the gentle crackle of the trees as they swayed in the wind, and a constant rhythm of crickets in the tall grass announced their presence to predators and mates alike. I still could not place where in Hampton this picture was taken. I wondered for a moment if my mom had gone out of town, taken a photo of some neighboring town. I decided it was unlikely, as anything over a 20-minute drive was, by her standards, a long haul. When I'd invited my mom to our wedding, she was overjoyed. She'd met Ella a few Thanksgivings ago, and by the end of the meal, she nodded approvingly. My wife was the kind to speak her mind on all matters, and she was funny when she did it. Traits that brought a lot of stock with Mom. As we were leaving for the airport and she was wishing us a safe journey, she'd pulled me in close and whispered, "Tommy." She was the only one who ever called me that. "She'll fit in here just fine," and then smiled warmly at us and waving as we pulled out of the driveway. My heart sank all the way down to my ankles. Her initial joy and approval soured when I told her the wedding was going to be in California. My grandmother, who still lived with Mom at the time, couldn't make that kind of journey, and there was no way that she could leave her alone. I told her that having the ceremony on the West Coast was just a practical matter. Ella had more friends and immediate family than I did. My family's inner circle had been dwindling for years as my hometown battled through financial hardship. More and more of the year-round residents had pulled up stakes. I'd tried to convince her that if we weren't able to find someone to check in on Grandma, any number of folks remaining in the area that owed her a favor or two at least, then we'd do a smaller ceremony in town. Mom had carefully explained that she couldn't impose on anybody like that. How could anyone but her possibly be expected to know the schedule of pills Gram took, what shows she liked, or how she took her soup in the evenings? "Tommy, you needn't bother with another ceremony," she said. She didn't need any second-hand sentiment, thank you very much. I felt a dibble of sweat run down my back, and I got up to check the thermostat. Ella had set it to a steady 78 degrees. I heard the air conditioning kick on in protest of the blistering triple-digit temperatures, and in a few moments the house cooled considerably. I pressed the back of my hand to my forehead, and it came away moist. I went into the kitchen to grab a dish towel and another beer. As I came back from the kitchen, the picture of Bicknell Cemetery was face up near the edge of the table. I would have sworn I had placed it face down. My eyes fell on the photograph of the mailbox, and seeing the two side by side, let something fall into place. The mailbox was not the one I remembered from my childhood, that having blown down in Hurricane Floyd back in 1999, but the address printed on the side was the same. 8601 Saconnet Lane. The mailbox was in front of my house, my mother's house. Across from it was the cemetery, but the trees, placed so tightly together, prevented any sight of it even in the bare skeletal state they were in the photo. Similarly, my house was hidden on the other side of the road. Even without the trees, the house was at the end of a winding half-mile of driveway, very much concealed until you rounded the final bend. My mother had told me when I was 9 that the street was named for the tribe that lived there years before our family had settled in. When I asked her where they lived now, she'd said that they hadn't gone anywhere. She told me that if I listened closely at night, I'd hear them roaming around the woods, angry and having their home taken away and looking for revenge. Oh, how she laughed when she found me under the blankets that night with a flashlight blazing away and my eyes wide in terror. I looked again at the address on the side of the solitary box. It was very clear, even in the gloom, and I wasn't sure how I could have missed it before. I pulled on my beer, closing my eyes to savor it, and when I opened them, my house was dark. Ella had bought thick insulated curtains to shut out the harsh California sun. It was easy to lose track of time. I pulled out my phone and saw that it was nearly 8 at night. There was also a voicemail from Ella. She was working late, and if I hadn't already, I should probably go ahead and grab myself something out of the fridge. Wasn't a bad idea. I sat at the table for just shy of 3 hours and had a sickly kind of buzz in my head. Beer on an empty stomach, something Mom had always warned me about. I picked up the envelope and saw that there were just 2 pictures left inside, and I nearly got up there. Nearly went into the kitchen and made something for my wife and me to eat together when she got home. Nearly. One of the last times I'd spoken with my mom, she told me that when I come home that year for Christmas, I better spend as much time with my grandmother as possible, as it was likely to be my last chance. Well, I'd heard some version of this every year since I could remember, and despite knowing that it was entirely possible, the frequent repetition had deadened its impact. We'd established a leapfrog holiday schedule since we'd gotten married. One year, it'd be Thanksgiving at my family's and Christmas at Ella's. The next year, the locations would swap, and every year I would get a call expressing the pressing concern of Grandma's mortality. Were those people out there really so much more important than my own family? Was she really going to have to suffer another holiday without her children? This had only gotten worse since Jake had gotten married and spent most holidays with his in-laws. After 4 years, I had finally had enough. I don't remember all the words that were said. I've probably chosen not to, but after many slings and arrows back and forth between us, I finally told her that just because she'd been too scared to go past the town line didn't mean that the rest of us had to die in Henton. My mother grew quiet. I began slathering into the receiver. I was sorry. I didn't mean that, but she had to see she was being unreasonable, didn't she? A marriage was give and take. I couldn't expect Ella to give up her family for mine. That wouldn't be fair to her, would it? My mother's end of the line was silent for a while, and then she said, "Well, Tom?" She'd never called me that before. "Seems you made your choice, then." I heard the sound of her old rotary phone clattering back into its cradle. Almost a year went by, and there were no calls, no letters, nothing. I'd speak to Jake every few weeks, and in between just catching up on what was going on with each of us and what new movies seemed like they'd be worth the price of admission, I'd ask how Mom was doing. Invariably, the answer would come back, "Good, she's good. Still mad as hell at you, Tom, but otherwise good." And he'd ask if I had any message I wanted to pass on. I never did. I slid a photo out of the sleeve, and my breath caught my throat. The floor in the photo, black and white just like the last, was littered with debris, mostly small, indistinct items. I could make out scraps of paper and the edges of trash bags that I knew were either filled with clothes that she had lacked the strength to carry up the stairs or actual garbage that she couldn't load into her car and take to the dump. There was a small empty flat of oranges with a graphic on the side that announced they'd come all the way from sunny Florida. Above it stood an old iron stove that had been attached to our chimney once. In the winter, when fuel was too expensive, Mom had burned firewood in it. The ambient heat would rise slowly, and the chill would lift from the house. Mom said it had been in our family for generations. It was a bulky monstrosity, heavy in weight, and covered in fine detail scrolling that must have been done by some artisan centuries ago. In the photo, it had been torn away from the wall for some reason. One of its doors hung, and an old ceramic bowl forgotten inside it was visible. When I stood in that kitchen, in that very scene, only months before, the air had been thick with decay and stillness, and I could smell it again. I snorted a few times, trying to force the phantom odor out of my nose. My grandmother had been slipping deeper into senility. The doctors would not call it Alzheimer's, but Jake told me that she often called his wife by Mom's name or one of her sisters, all of whom had passed away decades ago. As taking care of my grandmother had become more and more time-consuming, the other things in Mom's life began to slip away. When I finally made it back home, the chickens in the backyard hadn't had their eggs collected in months, and they sat rotting. The smell had been awful as we took away bag after bag of them. The yard work, one of my mother's great joys, had also gotten away from her. The lawn stood as tall as my knees. Branches of trees she'd planted before Jake had been born grew into each other, forming a canopy which denied the flowers below much-needed sunlight. One afternoon, as Jake and I were having a couple of beers in the kitchen, taking a break from the cleanup, a question that had been knocking around in my head just popped out. "Why didn't you help her?" "Why didn't you?" came the reply. "Me? I was in California." "Exactly." We never talked about it again. Jake had called me just a week prior to tell me about Mom's cancer. Like most things, she'd let her doctor's visit go by without any notice. When she developed a pain in her chest, she'd put it down to a muscle strain and never investigated further. It was around October when Jake had dropped by to check in on things and collect some of his PlayStation games. He noticed the pain on Mom's face when she tried to take something off the top shelf in the pantry. He'd driven her right to the doctor's office, then straight to the hospital. He called me, but I heard very little of what he said except metastatic and stage 4. He pressed the phone to my mother's mouth, and she said, in a parchment-dry voice dulled by the pain medication, "Come home, Tommy. It'll all be better when you're here." I was in the air when she died. I landed, and there was a voicemail from Jake. It happened about an hour prior. I lined up the pictures in the order they'd come in: the graveyard, the mailbox, and the kitchen. I was nauseous and tired. Looking at my phone, I realized that another hour and a half had passed without me noticing. I pulled the last photograph free. Unlike the others, it was in full color. The man, sitting at the table in a rumpled suit, his tie pulled loose around his throat like he'd gotten home hours ago and hadn't bothered to change. 2 empty beer bottles and a series of 3 photographs were laid out in front of him. A 4th was in his hand. I dropped the photo to the table and jumped up, fully expecting someone to be there, but I was alone. One of the bottles, jostled by my sudden movement, fell to the floor and smashed, glass sliding across the wooden floor. I stood there trying to piece together some reasonable explanation for this, but there was none. Slowly, I bent over the last photograph. Where before the man was sitting at the table, he now stood leaning over it. 1 empty beer bottle sat in front of him, and a series of photographs were laid haphazardly out next to it. I wanted to pick up all of those pictures and tear them to shreds, burn them. I wanted to get rid of any evidence that they had ever existed, but instead I sat down and picked up the last photo. I remained very still, not wanting to watch the man in the photo change position again. I wanted this world to be as stable as possible while I figured this out. As before, I felt a rising dampness, heard the wind make the woods around the house groan. Insects filled the night with alien calls, and the air became sour. When I looked up again, I was standing in a ruined kitchen filled with garbage. There was an old wooden stove pulled to the center of the room, and next to it was an old, flat, The advertisement on the side proudly proclaimed that it once held oranges all the way from Florida. I heard a door open and footsteps crunching across broken glass. "Tom?" Ella called out. "What's with all this? Tom, are you here?" "Ella!" I cried out. "I'm here!" I screamed. I tried to move toward the sound of her voice, but in the darkness I fell over something and hit the floor. A number of sharp objects poked me across my chest and abdomen, and something rotten squished under my knee. "Tom!" Her voice called out again, irritated. I realized that the photo was still in my hand. I lifted it to my face just in time to see Ella walk out of the dining room. "Ella!" I screamed. "Where's the broom?" I heard my wife say from the photo. There was the sound of a door opening and then closing, and that was the last thing I heard from her. I don't know how long I've been here. For the first few days, I tried to find a way out. I pulled at the front door for hours, but it wouldn't budge. I threw that orange box at the window, and after it bounced off, I picked it up and swung it like a bat at them. My hands ached, but the glass was none the worse for wear. I even tried going up to the second floor, but somehow I always ended up right back here. I can set my foot on the first step, but as soon as I lift the other off the kitchen floor, I find myself in front of the stove. The picture of my home back in California doesn't change. I look at it all the time, hoping that I'll see Ella or anybody walk through the frame, but it always is just a picture of the dining room with one beer bottle on the table and 3 photos laying face up next to it. I haven't slept since I got here, and my mind has started to make a noise. I don't know if it's crying or whimpering, but I've made it more often than not lately. I don't mind, though, because when I stop and there's no wind blowing through the trees and the bugs stop their piercing chirps, the smell of decay will get stronger in that quiet, that absolute quiet, and I hear a voice, parchment dry and dulled by pain meds, say, "Come home, Tommy. It'll all be better when you're here."